My name is Darlene Shelton. I am 61 years old, and for 26 years my daughter told people I abandoned her. I run the medical records department at a small hospital in Durango, Colorado. I keep things filed. I keep things dated. I keep the things nobody thinks to ask for until they do. 3 weeks ago, my daughter Phoebe called me for the first time in years. She invited me to meet her fiance's family, the Callaway's old ranching money outside town, the kind of family that studies a woman like me and decides everything about her before she even sits down. I said yes. I also packed a worn old paper into my coat pocket, folded the same careful way for more than 2 decades. It said something none of them were ready to hear. By the end of that dinner, my daughter didn't know what to do with it either. Welcome back to Alpha Mom Stories, where mothers who got counted out get the last word. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's begin. The house I own sits on a quiet street 2 miles from the hospital, small enough that I can heat it for under $100 most Januaries. I painted the kitchen myself the year I turned 55, sage green, a color nobody's opinion but mine had to approve. Most mornings, I'm at my desk by 7 sorting charts into a filing system I built from nothing over 22 years. Admissions discharges the quiet paper trail every patient leaves behind, whether they realize it or not. I like the order of it. I like that a record doesn't change its story depending on who's asking or how loudly they ask it. Younger staff come to me sometimes when 2 versions of the same event won't reconcile on paper. I always tell them the same thing. Find the original. Copies drift, originals don't. The hospital's compliance officer once told me I had the most audit-proof department in the building. I didn't take it as a compliment exactly. I took it as a description of how I'd rebuilt my whole life. I never remarried. I dated twice briefly men who wanted a version of me that laughed louder and asked fewer questions than I was built to ask. I let both of them go without much ceremony, and I didn't lose sleep over either departure. On my dresser sits a photograph of Phoebe, at 5 gap-toothed, holding a plastic shovel at a park whose name I've long since forgotten. It's the last picture I have of her. I didn't stop taking photographs. I stopped being anywhere she was, so there was nothing left for me to photograph. I don't look at it every day. I'm not that kind of sad. But I could walk to that drawer in the dark and put my hand on it in under 10 seconds, and some nights that's exactly what I do. There's a tremor in my left hand that surfaces when I'm tired, a small fine shiver I usually still by pressing my right hand flat over it. Patients in the front desk sometimes notice. I tell them it's an old muscle habit, and mostly 26 years later, that's even true. It started in a hospital bed in Denver, and it never fully left me. I don't talk about where it came from. It isn't some closely held secret. The hospital where I work keeps a version of that record in a filing cabinet I could walk to right now if I wanted to. I just don't see much use in handing people a story. They'll only end up feeling sorry for me over, and pity has never once fixed anything I actually needed fixed. Marilyn, who's worked the floor above me for 11 years, is the only person here who knows the whole shape of it. She found out by accident reading a form I'd left open on my desk one slow Tuesday, and she never once brought it up again unless I did first. That's the kind of friend worth keeping, I've decided. The kind who lets you choose when a wound gets air instead of deciding for you. I had no reason that week to think I'd be telling her the rest of it soon. But the phone was already ringing by the time I got home. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was rinsing a single plate at the sink. I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved, though something in my chest recognized the area code before my mind caught up with it. Mom. Phoebe's voice, 32 years old now, careful, like she was reading off a card. It's me. I set the plate down. My left hand started its small shiver, and I pressed it flat against the counter. She told me she was engaged to a man named Nathaniel Callaway, whose family owned a ranch outside Durango. I'd heard of only in passing, the kind of name that shows up in the newspaper for donations, not for arrests. His parents want to meet everyone, she said. An engagement dinner, 3 weeks from Saturday. Everyone. I turned the word over twice before I let myself hope what it might mean. I'd like you to come. she added, and there was a pause after it, a held breath I couldn't quite read across 400 miles and 18 years of silence. "I'll come," I said before I could talk myself out of it. She gave me the address. She didn't say she'd missed me. I didn't ask her to. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen a long time, the water still running, turning her voice over in my mind the way you turn over a coin to check if it's real. It sounded real. That was the problem. It had sounded real to me 18 years earlier, too. I told Marilyn the next morning over coffee that had gone lukewarm in the break room we've shared for over a decade. She didn't say congratulations. She knows me better than that. 18 years, Darlene, she said instead, and she calls you on a Tuesday like it's nothing. She called because his family wants a guest list that looks complete, I said. I know what this probably is. Then why are you going? I thought about it honestly before I answered, because Marilyn has never once let me get away with a version of myself that isn't true. Because there's a chance it isn't just that, I said. And because if I don't go, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering. Marilyn studied me, the way she studies a chart she doesn't quite trust yet, carefully twice looking for whatever's missing. Just don't go in there hoping to be forgiven for something you didn't do, she said finally. You've earned the right to just say yes for yourself, not for her. What if it's exactly what you think it is? I asked her. Marilyn shrugged the honest kind of shrug that doesn't pretend to have better information than you do. Then at least you'll know, she said. You've lived with not knowing long enough. I didn't have an answer for that one. I still don't, if I'm honest. But I wrote the date on my kitchen calendar in pen instead of pencil, and Marilyn, watching me do it, didn't say another word. She just refilled both our cups and let the silence do whatever work it needed to do. To tell you what happened at that dinner, I have to go back first to a night in February, 26 years ago, on a stretch of road called Wolf Creek Pass. I was 34, Phoebe was 5, asleep in her car seat behind me, a single red mitten still clipped to her coat because she'd lost its match somewhere in a grocery store parking lot an hour earlier. The pass climbs above 10,000 feet, and that night the temperature had dropped hard enough to turn the last of the day's snow melt into black ice invisible against the dark asphalt. Truckers called that "Stretch the Widowmaker" half in jest. Nobody I knew found it funny in February. I remember the radio playing something forgettable. I remember a green mile marker catching my headlights. I don't remember the semi-truck that had already jackknifed on that same ice 90 seconds ahead of where I hit it. I remember very clearly reaching back once to check that Phoebe's mitten was still clipped on right before the world tipped sideways. That's the last clear thing I remember for 3 weeks. They told me later that a trooper pulled her out of that car seat, unhurt, still holding the mitten's twin in her small fist, screaming for someone who wasn't there to answer. I have never once been able to ask her if she remembers that part. It's one of the only pieces of that whole night I actually want her to. Everything else, the hospital, the silence that followed, the years it swallowed, I would have handed back gladly. That one memory I would have kept for both of us. I woke up in a hospital in Denver 3 weeks later to a ceiling I didn't recognize, and a husband who wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Wendell was 36 then, a farm equipment salesman with a good tan and a temper he mostly kept in check. He was not a cruel man that February. He was a frightened one, alone with a 5-year-old and a wife the doctors couldn't promise would wake up the same if she woke up at all. I understand now why he did what he did next. Understanding it and forgiving it turned out to be 2 very different projects, and I never quite finished the second one. While I was still learning to hold a spoon steady, Wendell filed for divorce and asked the court for emergency temporary parental responsibilities. He wasn't lying to anyone. I genuinely could not care for a child. I could not yet reliably stand on my own. The court granted it that April, a temporary order built around one true sentence: the mother is medically incapacitated and unable to appear. Not unfit, not absent by choice, incapacitated. I didn't fight it from a hospital bed. There was nothing yet to fight. I told myself in the small, clear hours between physical therapy sessions, that this was temporary the way the paper said it was. I had no idea yet how long a word like temporary could be stretched, or how many people it would take to stretch it. By November, I was walking again mostly. By January, I had a lawyer and a petition to restore my parental responsibilities. Wendell fought it. His attorney used my own hospital records against me, the standard psychiatric evaluation every trauma patient receives at discharge, the one that notes anxiety and depression, like a weather report, and turns it into a weapon if a judge lets it become one. A guardian ad litem was appointed. Home studies were ordered. It took 18 months I still can't fully recall, without wanting to sit down somewhere quiet. Somewhere in the middle of it, I learned Wendell wasn't alone anymore. Corinne had been our neighbor, a woman who'd brought over casseroles and watched Phoebe some afternoons while I relearned how to walk to my own mailbox. By the time the permanent orders were signed that August, she and Wendell were already planning a wedding of their own. The court's final order gave Wendell primary responsibility, but it also gave me something the story never seemed to include: later standard parenting time, alternating weekends, 4 weeks every summer, written into the record in plain black ink by a judge who never once used the word unfit. I folded that order into quarters the day I received it, tucked it into a drawer, and told myself the fight was finally over. I didn't know yet that a piece of paper could tell the truth and still somehow lose. That order sat folded in a drawer and later a fireproof box for the next 24 years. While life did what life does, it kept moving whether or not anyone had settled the argument underneath it. I heard pieces of Phoebe's life the way you hear about a stranger you used to know well. Dot, a cousin of Wendell's who still sent me a Christmas card out of some old loyalty, mentioned once that Phoebe had moved back to Colorado for a marketing job sometime around 2020. Then this past spring, Dot mentioned an engagement to a Callaway. I looked the family up the way anyone would a ranch spanning several thousand acres outside Durango, a cattle and land business, 3 generations deep, a wedding registry site with a save the date I wasn't on. I looked at that registry longer than I meant to at place settings and linens I'd never be asked to help choose between. I didn't reach out. 18 years of silence teaches you exactly where the line is, even when nobody ever draws it out loud for you. So when Phoebe's name lit up my phone 3 weeks ago, my first thought wasn't hope, though hope arrived quickly enough behind it. My first thought, honestly, was something's changed. I just didn't know yet whether it had changed for the better or whether I was about to become useful to a story that had already been finished a long time without me. The last time I'd heard my daughter's voice before that Tuesday was in 2008. She was 14. I had gotten her number from Wendell's sister against his knowledge, and I called on a Sunday afternoon, rehearsed and terrified, certain that if I could just explain the accident in my own words, something might finally loosen. She let me talk for almost a full minute. "I know about the crash," she said when I finally paused. Her voice was flat in a way that frightened me more than anger would have. "Dad told me." Relief went through me first, foolishly. Then she kept talking. "He told me you decided recovering wasn't worth coming back for." Her voice didn't shake at all. "That you picked your new life over me." "Phoebe, that isn't you left," she said. "Just stay gone." She hung up before I could answer, and I sat on my kitchen floor a long time afterward, phone still warm in my hand, understanding for the first time that I wasn't fighting a court anymore. I was fighting a story that had already finished being told years before I ever got a single word into it. I didn't call again for a long time after that. I hadn't given up on her. I simply couldn't find a version of the truth small enough to fit through a door that had already closed, and I was tired of bruising my own hands against it. 3 weeks isn't much time to decide who you want to be in a room full of strangers who've already half decided who you are. I bought a new sweater for the dinner, ivory soft, the kind of thing that photographs kindly under warm light, and I wore the thin gold necklace I'd bought myself the year I made department director, a small private reward nobody else had ever noticed enough to ask about. I told myself I wasn't dressing to impress anyone named Callaway. I was dressing so that if Phoebe looked at me across that room, she'd see a woman who had done all right for herself, whatever version of my life she'd been handed over the years. Marilyn helped me pick out the coat plain wool, warm enough for a mountain evening, roomy enough in the inside pocket for more than gloves, though I hadn't fully admitted that second reason to myself yet. I bought a small gift, too, a set of monogrammed towels I agonized over longer than any set of towels has ever deserved. On the morning of the dinner, I told myself the hardest part would simply be walking through the front door. I had no real idea yet how wrong that would turn out to be. The phone rang 4 days before the dinner. A Colorado number I didn't recognize the area code unfamiliar enough that I almost let it go to voicemail. "Mrs. Shelton, this is Millicent Callaway." Her voice had the practiced smoothness of a woman used to being listened to the first time she speaks. She said she was calling about logistics, parking, dietary restrictions, what time I intended to arrive. It should have taken 90 seconds. It took 6 minutes, and somewhere around minute 3, her tone shifted into something colder, more deliberate. "I do want you to understand," she said, "that our family values honesty above almost everything else. Phoebe has been wonderfully honest with us about her history." "Her history," I repeated. "About her childhood," Millicent said. "I won't pretend it hasn't been discussed." I stood very still in my kitchen, the same tremor starting low in my left hand. "What exactly did she tell you?" I asked. "I think that's a conversation for Saturday, don't you?" Millicent said, and there was something almost pleased in it, a woman who had already drawn her conclusions and was only waiting for the room to agree with her out loud. She hung up with a pleasant goodbye that somehow felt like a door closing. I stood in my kitchen a long time after that, the phone still warm against my palm, understanding that whatever story Phoebe had told this family, it hadn't been mine to correct from 400 miles away. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept turning over the word history, the particular way Millicent had set it down like something already agreed upon by everyone but me. By morning, I'd made a decision that surprised even me. I still had the original permanent orders from 2002 folded soft at the creases from 24 years in a fireproof box. But soft and folded isn't the same as undeniable. If I was walking into a room full of people who had already decided a version of my life without me in it, I wanted something in my hand that couldn't be talked out of what it actually said. A certified copy, fresh ink, an official seal, straight from the court that had written it the first time. La Plata Combined Court keeps its own domestic relations files on record for exactly this reason. I'd learned that much, working 22 years around record systems that don't forget, just because remembering has become inconvenient for somebody. I called the clerk's office that afternoon. A woman with a pleasant, tired voice told me the case file was still active in their archive, that a certified copy would run $20, and that I could pick it up the same day if I came before 4. I hung up and sat with both hands flat on the kitchen table for a moment, the tremor in my left one finally briefly still. Whatever Phoebe had told them, I was about to be holding something that couldn't be argued out of what it actually said. The La Plata County Clerk's office smells like every records room I've ever worked in. Toner old paper, the same hush of a place where things get kept whether or not anyone's proud of them. The clerk found the file in under 10 minutes. Case number 00DR12. In the marriage of Shelton, 26 years old, and still sitting exactly where the system said it would be. She ran the copy, stamped it with a raised seal, took my $20 and slid it across the counter like it was nothing more than a parking permit. It felt like considerably more than that in my hands. At home, I set the new copy beside the original inside the fireproof box before I could talk myself out of opening it at all. The old one had gone the color of weak tea at its edges, soft as cloth, where it had been folded and unfolded more times than I'd ever bothered to count. Underneath both papers, where it had sat for 26 years, was a single red mitten, small enough to fit inside my palm, the yarn gone slightly matted with age. I hadn't looked at it in longer than I wanted to admit even to myself. I closed my hand around it for a moment the way I imagine a 5-year-old once did, and then I set it gently back down and closed the lid. The paper was what I'd come for. I told myself that twice before I actually believed it. The morning of the dinner, I sat at my kitchen table with both copies of the order in front of me and read the whole thing again, start to finish the way I hadn't let myself in years. Most of it was the dry architecture of family court dates, findings the case number printed at the top of every page. But partway down page 3 was the paragraph I'd been carrying in my memory far more often than in my hands. The court finds respondent mother's incapacity arising from injuries sustained February 14th to be medical in nature and does not find respondent mother unfit to parent. Mother shall have parenting time on alternating weekends and 4 consecutive weeks each summer, subject to modification upon a showing of changed circumstances. I had read that paragraph 100 times over the years, usually late at night, usually when I needed reminding that I hadn't imagined my own innocence. I was about to make it matter for the 101st. A judge had looked at my hospital records, my recovery, my petition, and had written in the plainest language available to the state of Colorado that I had not abandoned my daughter, that I had been given a schedule to come back to her whether or not anyone ever let me keep it. What happened after the move to Texas, the silence. The story Phoebe grew up believing about a mother who simply stopped wanting her, none of that lived inside this document. But this document was proof enough of exactly where the truth stopped and the story began. I folded it along its old creases, careful with the tea-colored original, careful with the crisp new copy, and slid both into the inside pocket of my coat. Before I go on, I want to say something directly to you if you've ever been the parent everyone quietly agreed was the villain of your own family's story. Stay with me. What happens at that dinner tonight is for you just as much as it's for me. Then I picked up my keys and I drove north toward the mountains, toward a house I had never once seen, carrying 26 years folded into a coat pocket, hoping the whole drive that I wouldn't need to take it out at all. I hoped that right up until I pulled through the gate. Whistling Elk Ranch announced itself a full mile before its gate, white plank fencing running along both sides of the county road, cattle grazing in pastures that probably cost more per acre than my entire house. The gate itself was iron unlocked, flanked by 2 stone pillars with the ranch's brand worked into the metal. A gravel drive wound another half-mile past a working barn, past a pond, catching the last orange light of the evening before the main house came into view, timber and stone. 2 stories windows already glowing gold against the coming dark. I parked between a pickup truck that cost more than my annual salary and a sedan I recognized, with a small drop in my stomach as belonging to Wendell. I sat in my car for a moment before getting out, one hand resting against my coat, feeling the shape of the folded papers through the wool. It steadied me more than I expected it to. I didn't think I would need it. I simply liked knowing it was there the way you like knowing where the fire extinguisher hangs, even in a house that's never once burned. I smoothed my sweater, checked that my necklace sat straight in the truck's side mirror, and walked toward a front door already propped open, laughter and low music spilling out into the cold evening air. Whatever this dinner was going to be, I was at the very least no longer walking into it unprepared. A young man in a pressed shirt met me at the door before I could even knock, tall, easy-shouldered, with Phoebe's same habit of tilting his head when he was nervous, which told me immediately who he was. "Mrs. Shelton, I'm Nathaniel." He shook my hand with both of his warmer than the moment strictly required. "I'm really glad you came." He led me through an entryway hung with old branding irons and a large oil painting of cattle in snow, into a great room dominated by a stone fireplace tall enough to stand inside. Family photographs lined the mantel, decades of Callaways at branding season, at graduations, at a wedding that must have been Reginald's own once. A man rose from a leather chair near the fire, 60-something silver-haired, dressed like he'd stepped out of a law office rather than off a ranch. He studied me for a beat longer than most people do before offering his hand. "Reginald Callaway," he said. His grip was firm, his eyes doing the kind of quiet inventory I recognized from my own habit of reading a chart before I trust what a patient tells me. "Welcome." Nathaniel had mentioned in one of our brief calls arranging the evening that his father had practiced family law for 30 years before retiring to run the ranch full-time. Looking at Reginald now, I believed it without needing to be told twice. Millicent appeared a moment later from the kitchen doorway, silver hair swept back a glass of white wine already in hand. "Mrs. Shelton," she said, offering 2 fingers rather than a full hand. "How lovely you could make the drive." Her smile didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. I recognized it instantly, the exact temperature of our phone call 4 days earlier, now finally given a face to match it. "Thank you for having me," I said, and meant it more than she likely deserved. Somewhere behind her I caught a glimpse of Phoebe's dark hair disappearing into another room. The great room filled steadily. Over the next half hour, cousins' ranch hands turned business partners. A pair of women, I gathered, were Millicent's oldest friends from the country club circuit. Nathaniel introduced me twice as Phoebe's mother, and both times I watched something flicker across the listener's face, a quick private recalculation, like they were checking my appearance against a story they'd already been told in advance. I made polite conversation about the mountains, about the ranch, about nothing that mattered much while I searched the room without seeming to for Phoebe. Millicent orbited near me twice, refilling glasses that didn't need refilling, offering commentary just loud enough to be overheard by whoever needed to hear it. "We're so particular about who we let into this family," she said once to no one in particular while looking directly at me. "Family that shows up matters so much more than family that simply exists." One of Millicent's country club friends, a trim woman in pearls, asked me brightly what I did for work. When I told her, she said, "How useful," in a tone that made the word sound smaller than she likely intended. Another guest, a young ranch hand who clearly hadn't gotten the room's memo yet, asked how I knew the family. "I'm Phoebe's mother," I told him. He looked genuinely delighted. "No kidding, she's great. You must be proud." It was the first uncomplicated sentence anyone had said to me all evening. A few heads turned at Millicent's comment about family that shows up. I felt my face hold steady out of 2 decades of practice, keeping a professional expression through worse things than one rich woman's insinuation. "I imagine it does," I said evenly and took a small sip of the sparkling water I'd been nursing all evening. Reginald from across the room caught my eye for just a moment, not unkindly, though not warmly either. Assessing still, a man deciding what kind of witness I might turn out to be before he committed to anything further. I had no way yet of knowing how right that instinct of his was about to prove. Phoebe found me near the fireplace a few minutes later, and for one unguarded second before she composed her face, I saw the 5-year-old who used to fall asleep with a red mitten clipped to her coat. Then the second passed. "You came," she said. Not a question, not quite a welcome either. "You asked me to." She was beautiful in the specific way I'd imagined she might grow into dark hair, careful makeup, a green dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage used to. She looked more than anything tired in a way that had nothing to do with wedding planning. "Nathaniel's parents can be a lot," she said, glancing past my shoulder toward Millicent. "Just don't take anything too personally tonight." It was such a strange thing to say 4 days after Millicent's phone call that I felt the tremor start low in my hand again. "Is there something I should know?" I asked her quietly. She looked at me, then really looked for the first time since I'd walked through the door, and something crossed her face I couldn't quite name yet. Not guilt, exactly. Closer to a woman checking a door was still locked behind her. "No," she said. "Just be yourself. That's all anyone wants tonight." She moved off toward Nathaniel before I could answer, and I stood alone by the fire a moment, turning her words over, already searching for the trap I suspected was folded somewhere inside them. Dinner was announced before I could find a private moment with Phoebe again, and I found myself seated between Nathaniel and an elderly Callaway aunt who spent most of the soup course discussing a horse she'd once owned. Nathaniel leaned toward me during a lull, his voice low enough to be just for me. "Can I ask you something? What was Phoebe like as a little girl?" It was such an ordinary question, it nearly undid me. "She loved the color red," I said carefully, choosing only what was true and only what was safe to hand over. "She had a stuffed rabbit she refused to travel without." "She still does that," Nathaniel said, smiling. "The rabbit's on a shelf in our apartment right now." Something in my chest loosened just slightly at that. "She laughed with her whole body," I added, "the way small kids do before anyone teaches them not to." "I'm glad to hear that," I said, and found I meant it without reservation, whatever else was sitting folded in my coat pocket 2 rooms away. He topped off my water glass without being asked, an easy, unconscious kindness that reminded me briefly of the kind of husband I used to imagine Phoebe might someday find. I hadn't let myself imagine it in years. He studied me for a moment. "She doesn't talk about her childhood much. I always got the sense there was more to it than what I'd heard." I chose my next words the way I choose words in a chart. Accurate, careful, nothing added that wasn't strictly mine to add. "There's always more to it," I said. "There usually is with anyone. I want to pause the story right here and say this directly to you if you've ever had to choose your words, that carefully around your own child, you already know exactly how heavy that dinner table felt. Stay with me. It gets heavier before it gets lighter." Nathaniel nodded slowly like he was filing the answer away for later, and the soup bowls were finally cleared. The main course arrived with a second bottle of wine, and the conversation grew looser, louder, the loose ease of people who trust the room they're sitting in. It was a cousin of Millicent's, a heavy-set man named Dale, with a rancher's sunburn and an easy laugh, who leaned across the table toward Phoebe with the confidence of someone repeating something he'd been told was safe to say. "Millicent told us your story," he said warmly, raising his glass slightly toward her. "Takes real strength what you've done, building a whole life after a mother just walks." The table quieted by degrees, the way rooms do when they sense something is about to matter. Phoebe's fork stopped halfway to her plate. Her eyes found mine for exactly 1 second before dropping back to her lap. "Dale?" Nathaniel said a warning note under the single word. "What I'm just saying, it's admirable." Dale, oblivious, reached for the wine bottle again. "Not everyone could do what you did, Phoebe. Rise above something like that." I kept my face still, the professional stillness I'd built over 22 years of delivering difficult things to worried families. Under the table, my left hand had gone tight around my napkin. Something like what I wanted to ask. I didn't. Not yet. Across the table, Reginald had gone very quiet, his attention moving between his cousin, his future daughter-in-law, and me, with the patient care of a man cataloging inconsistencies he hadn't yet decided what to do with. He had the look of a man reading a contract for a clause that didn't match the summary he'd been given. I noticed. I don't think anyone else at that table did. They arrived during dessert, apologizing for the drive up from the airport, Wendell first silver at his temples, now still carrying himself like a man used to being the most confident person in a room. Corinne followed a step behind him in a burgundy dress, a tight smile already fixed in place. The room shifted to accommodate them, the way rooms shift for family easy and practiced. Millicent rose to embrace Corinne like an old friend. Reginald shook Wendell's hand warmly. Nobody rose for me. A server offered them both a glass of wine before anyone had offered me a second sparkling water, and I noted it the way I note any small omission at work, not with hurt, exactly just with the flat clarity of a woman used to keeping her own count. Wendell's eyes found mine across the table, and for a moment something crossed his face. I couldn't quite name, not guilt, exactly closer to the flicker of a man recalculating an old story he'd told so many times he'd nearly started believing it himself. "Darlene," he said with a small nod. "Been a long time." "It has," I agreed. Corinne didn't meet my eyes at all. She busied herself instead with her wine glass with a compliment to Millicent about the flowers with anything that wasn't the woman sitting across the table, whose child she had helped raise on a story I was only now beginning to understand the full shape of. I remembered her faintly from 26 years ago, the neighbor with the good casseroles, the one who'd watched Phoebe some afternoons while I relearned how to hold a spoon steady. I wondered watching her now exactly when that kind of kindness had curdled into something she felt she needed to protect instead. I didn't ask. Not yet. The evening wasn't finished with any of us, and some part of me already understood that. Millicent seated Corinne beside her for coffee, the two of them falling into easy conversation about wedding florists, and I understood watching them exactly what kind of story had been told in this house long before I ever arrived in it. Corinne was the mother who'd stayed. Corinne got the warm hand on the forearm, the refilled cup, the casual belonging that comes from being cast as the reasonable one in someone else's tragedy. I learned later from a comment Millicent made in passing to her sister, part of why she held so tightly to that particular kind of story. Years earlier, a nephew of hers had married into a family with what she called complications. A father in and out of the picture, a messy custody history nobody in her circle could quite make sense of, and the marriage had collapsed publicly enough to still get mentioned at holidays, a cautionary tale about what happens when uncertainty gets let into a family's bloodline. Millicent had vouched for that bride herself at the rehearsal dinner, only to be proven wrong within the year. I don't think she ever quite forgave herself for the vouching. Simple stories were safer to Millicent. A mother who left was simple. A mother who'd been hospitalized, litigated against, and quietly worn down over years was complicated, and complicated things frightened her more than plain cruelty ever seemed to. I thought, listening to her laugh warmly at something, Corinne said that fear rarely announces itself as fear. It usually shows up freshly pressed, wearing pearls, offering to refill your coffee before you've finished your first cup. I didn't know any of that with certainty yet sitting at that table. I only knew the shape of it, the warmth going one direction, the cold coming mine, and a daughter across the table who had apparently decided at some point which version of me was easier to hand this family. I finished my coffee. I waited for whatever was coming next. Reginald rose near the end of coffee, tapping his glass gently for quiet, and the room settled into the particular hush that precedes a toast. "We don't do this often," he said. "Welcome someone new into this family, but Nathaniel chose well, and we're glad to have Phoebe among us." Warm applause. Phoebe's hand found Nathaniel's under the table. Millicent rose, next glass in hand, and I felt the temperature of the room shift before she'd said a single word. "This family has been fortunate," she said, looking not at Phoebe but somewhere just past my shoulder. "We raise children in stable homes, parents who understand that showing up is the whole job." She paused, letting it settle. "Not everyone is built for that kind of sacrifice," she went on. "Some women simply aren't built for motherhood. It takes a particular strength to become one anyway out of nothing." Her eyes moved finally to Phoebe. "The way Phoebe has had to," she said, "to that strength to Phoebe." Glasses rose around the table. I felt every eye that dared find mine and then quickly look away, the specific discomfort of a room agreeing with something cruel because disagreeing seemed impolite in the moment. I raised my own glass an inch because refusing would have made a scene I wasn't ready to make yet, and because I had learned a long time ago that dignity sometimes looks exactly like drinking to a toast that was actually aimed at you. Across the table, Phoebe wouldn't lift her eyes from her plate at all. I set my glass down and waited to see what she would do with the silence that followed. The toasts might have ended there if Dale, 3 glasses of wine into the evening, hadn't leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who thought he was helping. "Phoebe, honey, you should tell them," he said. "Your story. It's a good one, the hard kind that makes the happy ending mean something." A ripple of encouraging murmurs went around the table. Someone said gently, "Oh, you don't have to." Someone else said just as gently, "But it really is remarkable what you overcame." Phoebe went very still. I watched her weigh something behind her eyes, a flicker of the same hesitation I'd seen by the fireplace earlier, the door-checking look. Then I watched her decide. She set down her napkin. She stood smoothing her green dress with both hands, and the room quieted to receive her the way rooms quiet for brides. "Okay," she said softly, and her voice already carried the practiced catch of something rehearsed, something she had told before, maybe to Nathaniel alone in the dark, maybe to herself in a mirror, until it came out smooth every single time. She looked finally directly at me. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, the folded papers a quiet weight against my ribs beneath my coat, and I did the only thing I knew how to do right then. I let her begin. The fire popped once behind her, and then the room was silent enough to hear it settle. Her voice shook right on cue, in the way voices shake when they've rehearsed shaking. "I was 5 years old," Phoebe said, "when my mother decided she didn't want to be my mother anymore." The room went silent the way a room goes silent for a bride, then stayed silent for something else entirely. "There was an accident," she said. "She was hurt, and I understand that I do. But when she got better, she didn't come back for me. She chose a different life, a quieter one without a 5-year-old in it." I felt every eye in that room shift toward me like a single held breath. "My father raised me alone," she said. "Then Corinne did. They never made me feel like something left behind." Her voice cracked precisely on the word left, even though I was. Millicent's hand found her own throat. Somewhere down the table, a woman murmured something sympathetic under her breath. I spent my whole childhood being the girl whose mother walked away. And now, Phoebe said, her eyes finally coming up, finally finding mine, glassy and bright. "Now that I'm marrying into a family like this one, now after 26 years, here she comes, crawling back." The word landed exactly where she'd aimed it. Wendell's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on his plate. Corinne had gone the color of the tablecloth. Nobody at that table was looking at me with anything close to warmth. I let the silence sit a moment longer, the way you let a wound finish bleeding before you touch it, before I finally moved. I want to tell you what I felt in that silence, because I think you deserve the honest answer rather than the dramatic one. I didn't feel rage. I felt something closer to grief settling into a shape. I finally recognized the shape of a story that had been allowed to grow unchallenged for 26 years in rooms I was never once invited into. I let it finish. I let every word of it land exactly the way Phoebe needed it to land, because interrupting a grieving woman, even one, grieving a lie, has never once made anything true faster. Then slowly I set my napkin on the table. I stood. The chair legs scraped against hardwood, the only sound in a room that had gone otherwise completely still. 25 pairs of eyes swinging toward the woman who was apparently about to confirm every terrible thing they'd just been told about her. I was not shaking. My voice, when it finally came, was quiet enough that people had to lean in slightly to catch it, which I've found works far better than volume ever does. "You can sit down now, Phoebe," I said. "This will only take a minute." I reached inside my coat. Phoebe sat slowly, her rehearsed composure flickering for the first time all evening into something closer to confusion. "I am not going to argue with a story," I said. "You've believed it since you were 14. I drew the papers from my coat pocket, one worn and old, gone the color of tea at every crease, and beside it a crisp new certified copy, its raised seal catching the firelight. "But records don't grow," I said. "They just wait." I set both copies on the table in front of Phoebe, smoothing them flat with 2 fingers, the same careful motion I use 100 times a week on charts that matter far less than this one. "This is the permanent order from my divorce from your father," I said. "Case number 00DR112, La Plata County. I want you to read it, all of it if you have time." I paused. "But there's one paragraph I'd like your fiance's father to read out loud. He'd know better than I would whether it says what I think it says." I looked at Reginald. "I'm told you practiced family law for 30 years, I said. "Would you mind—" The room had gone so quiet I could hear the fire settling in the hearth, and somewhere behind me a chair creaked as someone leaned forward to see better. Reginald set down his coffee cup without a word and reached for the paper. Reginald picked up the certified copy without hesitation, the reflex of a man who had spent 30 years trusting paper over performance. He read in silence for a moment, his eyes moving down the page, and I watched something in his posture change, a straightening, the particular stillness of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the evening so far. "Read it out loud, Dad," Nathaniel said quietly. "Please." Reginald cleared his throat. "The court finds respondent mother's incapacity arising from injuries sustained February 14th to be medical in nature and does not find respondent mother unfit to parent." He paused, then continued. "Mother shall have parenting time on alternating weekends and 4 consecutive weeks each summer." He looked up first at Phoebe, then at Wendell, then last at me. "This is a certified court order," he said into a silence so complete I could hear the mantel clock ticking above the fire. "Courts do not award parenting time to a mother they believe abandoned her child." Phoebe's face had gone white. "I didn't abandon you," I said quietly to her, and only her, though every person at that table heard it. "I was left behind. There's a difference. And for 26 years, nobody let you learn it." Nobody spoke. Somewhere down the table, a wine glass was set down with a small, too loud click against the table. It had taken less than 3 minutes start to finish for the entire architecture of my daughter's story to come apart in front of the family she had built it for. Her act was over. Nobody in that room needed to be told twice. Millicent recovered first in the way people like Millicent always do. "Well," she said, setting down her glass with a hand that wasn't quite steady, "I can hardly be blamed for repeating what I was told in good faith." Wendell's chair scraped back. "This isn't the time or the place to relitigate." "You had 26 years for a better time and place," I said, and he stopped. He had no argument ready. I don't think he'd ever imagined in all that time a room where the paper would simply be produced and read aloud by someone he couldn't talk over. Corinne hadn't said a word. Her eyes were fixed on the tablecloth, and when I glanced at her, I thought of 13 birthday cards mailed and never once acknowledged, and I decided watching her face that she already knew exactly why. "The cards I sent," I said, quietly, not unkindly, just to her. "You don't have to tell me what happened to them tonight. I think you already know that I know." Corinne's eyes filled. She said nothing at all. It was Phoebe who moved next, reaching for the certified copy with hands that weren't steady, reading the parenting time paragraph herself, silently, her lips barely moving over the words. "Nobody ever showed me this," she whispered, and for the first time all evening there was nothing rehearsed in her voice at all, just a woman finding out in front of 25 witnesses that the floor she'd built her whole story on had never actually been there. She didn't look at me. She looked instead at her father. Wendell didn't answer whatever question was in his daughter's face. He reached instead for his water glass, his jaw working a man with no version of events left that could survive being read out loud a second time. Nathaniel stood. He crossed to where I was still standing beside the table and gently took my elbow the way you'd steady someone twice your age crossing ice, though I didn't need steadying nearly as much as he seemed to think I did. "Mrs. Shelton, I am so sorry," he said, quiet enough that it was mostly meant for me. "This was never supposed to happen this way. None of it. You didn't do anything wrong," I told him, and meant it. Around the table, the party had dissolved into the particular murmuring chaos of people who don't know where to look at Phoebe frozen, at Wendell silent, at Corinne still crying without any sound at all, at Millicent smoothing her napkin as though that might smooth the last 5 minutes along with it. I looked once more at my daughter. She was still holding the paper. She still hadn't looked up. I picked up my coat from the back of my chair and I began quietly to say my goodbyes to a room that had arrived at this dinner already certain of who I was. Reginald walked with me toward the entryway, his hand resting briefly respectfully on my shoulder. "Stay for dinner, Mrs. Shelton," he said. "Please." "I only came to stop a lie from sitting down at your table," I told him. "I didn't come to fight for a seat at it. I think I'd rather go home now if that's all right." He nodded, understanding it in the way only another careful person could. Nathaniel caught up with us near the door, and before I could say goodbye to him too, I heard him turn back toward the great room toward his mother. "You said some women simply aren't built for motherhood," he said, not loudly but clearly enough to carry. "Look at what she built anyway. 22 years running a hospital department. A house paid off with her own name on the deed." He didn't stop there. "A daughter she never once stopped being the mother of," he said, "whether anyone let her prove it or not." Millicent didn't answer him. I hadn't asked Nathaniel to say any of that. I found, standing in that doorway with my coat half on, that I didn't mind he had. "Thank you," I said to him quietly, and I meant it for more than just the sentence he'd offered on my behalf. He walked me all the way to my car, insisted on it, and stood in the cold a moment after I'd started the engine, like he wanted to say something else, and hadn't quite found the shape of it yet. "I'll call you," he said instead. "Regardless of everything, I'd like to actually know you." I drove home through the dark with the mountains black against a sky still holding a little blue at its edges, the radio off both copies of the order back in my coat pocket where they'd started the evening. At home, I opened the fireproof box one more time before bed, and I found the small red mitten sitting exactly where it always sat. I held it for a moment the way I had at the courthouse days earlier, and this time I let myself cry quietly for the 5-year-old who'd once held its match, and for the 26 years neither of us ever got to choose. Then I put it away gently and closed the lid. Marilyn called before I'd even taken my coat off, as if she'd been sitting by her phone all evening waiting to hear how it went. I told her everything start to finish, and she was quiet for a long moment before she said simply, "Good." 3 weeks later, Reginald called to invite me to lunch. I said yes. I heard secondhand that the wedding planning has slowed to something closer to a stop. Phoebe texted me once 4 words long. I haven't answered yet. I will when I finally know what I want to say back to her. People sometimes ask me when they learn pieces of this story whether I forgive my daughter for the 26 years for the story she told a room full of strangers before she ever once asked me for the true one. I tell them forgiveness was never really the question I went there to answer. I wasn't in that room to be forgiven, and I wasn't in it to punish anyone either. I was in it because a record I'd kept folded and careful for a 1/4 of a century deserved finally to be read by the one person it was actually about. I was left behind, but I never once let go, not of the paperwork and not if I'm honest of her. Maybe someday Phoebe will call and ask me the rest of it, the parts that don't fit on any court document, the small, ordinary years we both lost. If she does, I'll answer. I kept that order filed for 26 years for one simple reason. Some part of me never stopped believing the truth was still worth having on hand. That's my story. 26 years of silence and one certified paper that finally caught up to all of it. If you've ever been the parent everyone quietly decided was the villain, I hope tonight felt like proof that records outlast rumors, that the truth kept carefully enough can still hold its shape after decades folded in the dark. I'm not waiting on an apology from anyone at that table. I already got the only thing I actually came for. Thank you for being here with me tonight. If this story meant something to you, Drop a comment and tell me. Hit subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.